absolute honor and privilege it is to be here for the third year now, getting to moderate this event of just an incredibly deep and talented pool of writers, artists, authors, whatever you want to call them, just incredible people who are a part of our community. And to have you all come here as our community and join us in this day of fellowship and artistry, it's just really an honor, and I'm so pleased to be here and able to be a part of that community. So to start out, we're going to start really strong, and I hope you'll keep the energy for the full day because we're going to continue strong throughout the entire program. I'm happy and honored to introduce first today, Tanya Berry.
Thank you, Emily. Greetings. I'm not used to doing this, so you'll forgive me for any pauses. I've been asked to say a few words about my father, and his artworks are across the street, as we have just heard. It became clear to me when I started going through all the stuff I have about my father, Cliff, that it would be impossible to say a few words, but I'll try to be brief. Thomas Clifford Amix was born in McKee, Jackson County, Kentucky, eastern Kentucky, in 1909. To Dr. William Thomas Amix and Elizabeth Campbell Amix, who was 1/4 Cherokee, I'm proud to say. The family later moved to Livingston in Rockcastle County. Dr. Amix was then employed by the L&N Railroad. Of this time, my father wrote in Appalachian Heritage, quote, "Near the beginning of World War I, when I was only 6 or 7, my father bought the home of Senator Bond across the river. And during my first year at school, I accompanied my father across the railroad bridge. The bridge was double-tracked, and there was always the danger of getting caught between 2 trains. But we managed." This horrified me. "And before long, I was able to cross by myself. The winter of 1918 was the winter of the so-called Spanish influenza epidemic, and my father, the doctor, went for months with very little sleep. My whole family was sick in bed at one time. It was a cold winter, and when I was again on the way to school, with winds blowing across the bridge, I felt that I would be frozen to death. At our house across the river, I could stand in my front yard, especially in the summers, to see the trains halt just before the bridge and the engine go into town for more coal and water. While the lead engine was there, a helper engine would back up to be coupled to the train. And then when the lead engine came back, the two would belch black smoke and hiss white steam until they had a full head of steam and power. I felt these engines were alive with power, and trains were an endless excitement to me. When I began to draw pictures, they were almost always of trains and engines, and this was the first mention I'd heard of early artwork from my dad. I would lie on the floor, drawing trains for hours until the light was so dim I could hardly see. It did not occur to me that these sooty monsters were producing something which ate our wire fences quickly. It was only the endless washing of clothes and the human body, which was the obvious connection between the sooty engines and the blackened places where we lived. Later, the family moved to Lexington. My father and mother were classmates at old Lexington High School. It was later Henry Clay High School from which I graduated. They graduated together and were in the award-winning mixed quartet together. In the yearbook, Cliff was named most astute, and Dee was named most comely. Okay. They were not dating at the time. Cliff was the art editor of the yearbook. He was also on the debate team, winning many, many medals, doing quite well in individual honors and group. Later, after graduating from UK, after graduating, having lost both his parents, he moved to California, the Bay Area, where the art scene was quite active, and a friend advised him to go to California. I think that friend was my Aunt Anne, who did the fresco in Memorial Hall at UK, and my father had met her at the University of Kentucky because she was an art student there. Anne had already moved there, where we had many relatives. My Aunt Anne was a very good artist, and we hope we can save the fresco. Cliff had a scholarship in the California School of Fine Arts. My mother, Dee, moved out to California. They married, took up residence in Mill Valley, just north of San Francisco. There were lots of artists there. When I was young, I thought everyone was an artist. By 1939 to 1941, Cliff was the assistant supervisor of the Federal Art Project in San Francisco, working with many well-known people, one of whom was Diego Rivera. He had exhibits of his own work by that time in the area. After some severe medical procedures, I think he realized he needed a real job and came back to the University of Kentucky to teach and got an additional degree. And after a couple of other teaching jobs moving around, and he hated them, he came back to UK to teach in 1946, teaching studio classes and later art history and aesthetics. He was considered an important influence on the growth and character of the UK art department, serving as chair of the department several times, though he did not like that job. He retired in 1978. A once student of his, Jim Foose, said, "He was one of the finest teachers I have ever had in my life. I can count on one hand the ones I know who have stuck in my life," and Clifford Amix was one of them. He also added that he had some of Cliff's work in his own home. Cliff made all kinds of art, including, later in his life, beautiful small books, doing all the work himself, making linoleum blocks, translating poems, printing on a small letterpress, binding, drawing, etc. They are extraordinary works of art. He also wrote a lot of criticism for professional journals, including, to name only two, the Kenyon Review and the Journal of Aesthetics and Criticism. My father and mother traveled as much as they could, back and forth to California, back and forth to Europe. They traveled a lot with me. I went to 22 different schools in my school time. Cliff lectured in this country as well as in Europe. He was always learning, studying, seeing, drawing, painting, and writing. He even wrote a utopian novel late in his life. I've enjoyed rereading old clippings and reviews, especially a review by Sarah Lansdale in the Courier-Journal. They had an art editor then. About a show in Louisville in 1978. She wrote, quote, "The show of Cliff's is richly endowed with aesthetic certainty and the experiences of a seeing eye. Amix's black and white drawings have long been among my favorite contemporary works. Fragile, yet substantial, these are landscapes seen with devotion. Salisbury Cathedral, seen across a meadow with cows and sightseers. An Austrian lake and mountains. A farm compound in Tuscany with shepherd and sheep. These wiry, slightly spidery pictures cover a lot of landscape in a way that Cézanne did, probing into earth, stones, trees, for their true character. I am so moved that Virginia and Ben took on this project to have this show of my dad's work. It means a lot to me. I walked into Heritage House a while ago, and there's a recording there of him being interviewed, and it was quite a moment to hear his voice there with his artwork there. I would like to say in closing that in thinking of my father's life and his relationships with so many other people in the arts, there was never a sense of competition or jealousy, only camaraderie and appreciation. I think this continuing congregation of writers coming together here feels so free of competition and so full of appreciation of a sense of companionship and support for each other's gifts. So I thank you all. This listening and sharing with each other is priceless in our competitive world. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Emily. Go slowly. Leaves drift on the creek in a pool where wind more than current moves them. Below their swirling passage is water so clear that bottom-dwelling Rocks and moss look large. I step through the breezy curtain at the surface into that clarity with both feet. It's cool and slippery. I go slowly, reaching for the logs that have soaked up enough water to make mushrooms and hauling them up where they will have time to work that out. Collective flight. Blackbirds chattered in the trees above me when sun first blazed yellow, sounding like leaves chucked by wind and gleaming, black-holed. They shifted in the branches across the canopy. I laughed and they leapt, clattering off in collective flight. All day, wing-beaten breeze dipped over the woods. By evening, I expected birds, and they came over my head, turkey vultures solemn, in a line so low the dog and I heard their weight whistle when their wings pressed air. When night fell, it came as a black bird who reached over the woods and bundled us all in collective flight. Sing for your supper. An indigo bunting perched above the garden to sing for his supper. A cicada flew by and he ate it. I was weeding and watched. I'd still recommend farming, but if you have the chance to be a bird in a cicada year, I'd say take it. To the white oaks. For all your years, you never needed me. And for all mine, I never knew I needed you. But now I have walked onto your hills. I've seen you with evening rose behind you. I've seen you with morning silver on you. I've raised my arms into your gesture. I've wept below you. I seek you out to be with you. I reach with all my heart toward you, and I sing to give you what I can. Humanity lit by morning silver, evening rose, and white oak. This one's for my son, Philip. Nearly 18. As soon as he left, I heard him come back, but it was fire. The wood in the stove caught and roaring like a Mustang, like a boy lit from home. Practice. I want you guys to all do this. If you need practice seeing what there is, go to the woods and pull invasives. It's illuminating. You put yourself in position to see what you don't want to find. Honeysuckle, garlic mustard, privet, euonymus. To do this, you walk everywhere, make multiple passes along a slope, peer diligently into brush, bend and lean. Sometimes you have to pull hard to get a big bush. Sometimes you work in the rain. Sometimes you find flowers. Imagine if you tried this hard to see beyond the woods. Imagine if you tried this hard to see yourself. It's the same process. When you get to what you don't want to find, you can clear it, like putting garlic mustard in a bag or dangling honeysuckle from a tree. You have to be willing to handle it and then be willing to occupy all that open space. Last one. Lullaby to the world. The world needs it, and we can all sing it. It goes best that way, in all the languages, with everyone's voice, in whatever tune that's human. It's ours to create. It's open and loving. It connects us, completes us, transcends us. Sing a lullaby to the world. Sing for the others who are you. Sing for yourself. Sing a lullaby to the world. Thank you very much.
Hey, everybody. How you doing? Good. So I'm often asked, how did I go from living in the inner city of Louisville to now living in Berea on a farm? And this poem sort of speaks to that. This is called Grandma's Greens. On the forgotten side of a Babylon is where Grandma's garden hung, shadowed by a silo mountains in earshot of smoky iron rivers. We left the asphalt to spend the growing season with her. Our young knees bent into turned earth. We built foliage cities of collard, mustard, and turnip by tossing embryos in ancient gridded rows as Grandma chanted incantations and bushy jade heads sprung from the dirt to swallow sun. Grandma's babies' jobs were to harness aluminum clouds, to precipitate on the leaf palaces, to mine weeds with bent tridents, to defend the veiny structures from critters. But once the plants got waist high, Grandma would tell us to decapitate them all to the altar of kinfolk. And on the rim of dusk in a screened porch temple, over a carpet of newspaper, we picked their sturdy flesh clean from spindly stalks, squash any bugs, then have her anoint our offerings. With her thorough inspection before she marches every emerald bushel into her cauldron of rolling aromatics, roots, and spices, the greens scream a bit, hitting the boiling water. Their leathery texture softens as they drown, sending out unseen signals to relatives all the way in Newburgh, down to Alabama, Houston, even my home blocks away. The hairs on our necks stand on end when another pot brews, and sooner or later we find ourselves around a too small table in a too small house, and everyone's just fine. We can't resist the polarity of those steaming plates of Grandma's hocus pocus that she passes like an heirloom across several generations. Even after her matriarchal reign, grandbabies and their babies will practice the high art of potioning greens and conjuring family. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm gonna read a couple more because I have longer poems, so they go, it burns up a lot of time. I lived in Kentucky and I moved out to Berea, of course, from the inner city, and I was thinking, I'm gonna get away from all the noise and the sounds of the city, but then I found out that the country has sounds of its own, and it's been inspiring a lot of work for me. This is one of the inspirations. It's called A Micro Essay from Ornamental Grass. You call me fescue, Bermuda, or even Kentucky bluegrass, like I've been over here all along, but like you, I'm just a feudal remnant, haphazardly broadcast across dispossessed lands. The colonizer's blueprint, a rolled out carpet of familiar Eurasian green ahead of your arrival, savagely replacing all the native big blue stem stands and gamma grasses and switch grasses that multiculturally bunch across the savanna with my sun-burnable blades of homogeneity, which collapse with every frequenting drought, with my shallow roots that shed off millennia of spongy topsoil and retain no moisture with every growingly intense storm. I was the scout that softened this land for your ancestors' conquest. Maybe that's why now You spend 3 to 6 hours a week worshiping me, listening to the putter of horse-powered, piston-popping, zero-turn sermons, suppressing any attempts of the natural and the diverse to supplant me with your cultish ceremonies of petro-fertilizing baptisms and routine mass circumcisions at the front yard church of perpetually pruned and pristine holy lawns of your fathers. Unaware of your deification of me, or otherwise, you would call me something else. Thank you. I'm going to close with a poem. So a lot of the poems in this book are about family. I write about nature too, but I write a lot about family. And this is one of my favorite family poems, and I would like to share it with y'all if y'all don't mind. It's called The Good Couch. And y'all may have some familiarity with what I'm talking about here. The Good Couch. In the living room sat the couch, one of them splurge items, an oatmeal tweed burlap thing purchased spontaneously at Value City. And for the good couch reason, my parents covered it with a sheet of plastic, foggy, heavy synthetic skin that rustled with every motion. When summers smothered up, scorching hot days back when home AC was a myth to me, something not felt but alluded to on TV. On those simmering evenings, primetime bubbled across blue flickering screens, couch filled to capacity with family, and box fans propped in windows, making our house a convection oven. We would broil on that couch as its transparent epidermis bonded with our bare arms and legs, so that, of course, I would have to wait until the next commercial break, because the sound of me ripping clean from the Velcro couch would have drowned out the TV a bit, and everyone would have thrown a fit, because Cosby might have said something witty in his air-conditioned brownstone. Thank y'all.
Thank y'all for having me here. I, too, am a son of Louisville, but I won't elaborate much more than that because Crystal says I talk too much. So, although if anyone has any acreage of land, we would like to, raise goats or something someday. Bleeding the calf. It happened here, I say, pointing to nebulous ink stain where throat was split, slitting me into new language. A black right leaving deep serration into voices black vinyl, anti-opulent, the onyx spewed, a crude Niger Delta sludge spilling from jugular veins. And this sacrificial lamb you see before you became a Southern laureate, a voodoo and Dadaist, Argo futurist, my dark surrealism written in slang. Age-old conjurers came and bled the calf. What could I but comply? Culled me they did from the obsidian pooled at their feet, where dusk, dust, and dung-covered hands drew signets in the gelatins they stood in, commanding dark algebraic emblems to stand and recite a science. Then them, these stick-figured bones stood up, becoming me. They danced, and I became a one-man museum, a country ring shout walking, a nation throughout, not just a nation within. And now my throat, like a jar, preserves the tar from a borealis, where old eclipse and all temerity heals, every hieroglyph hidden deep, like a tonsil in the mouth of space and time. These entrails of witticism, cup your hands and sup from slashes, bring Tupperware, if not calabashes, keloids occur from where the cosmos is smudged. The rouge of rue in my every word, obeas for the black pigeon, a conviction for the canonically absurd. Where dawn is denied a body, a coruscating genesis, its nascent tongue and vibratory moral, the flora of the open palm closing, the anti-entropy of my bleeding heart, this nosegay of poetry. I sit up in bed, the calla lilies in my locks on fire. I sit up in bed, an array of shadows in my lungs. This lumbering dark is dense in the glow, and from some inner event horizon, the mirific comes prowling. The Night Hawks for Farragher and Farragher is my version of Alice in Wonderland, and there's one in the middle section of his collection. After Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. Seeking counsel, I haunt solace in greasy spoons beneath sick neon. Oil churns and hoary caffeine, each cup empty of lucid nirvana. Formica frames me holding frigid dusk at bay, eldritch but idle. An unsolicited privilege, my genesis for the serene, drowns lament in lukewarm coffee before Arcadian geniture. Softness has epiphanies, haint is ample with heft, atmosphere is formed within now barking soul, stillness births a rattle for matriarchy, a luxuriant lunarness enriched by the presence of eclipse. Though a dark globule, I'm irrepressibly bright within soft umbras, a lamppost made holy by shadow's uncontainable night brigade. And I'm gonna read 2 pages from a 8-page poem. So I'm trying to save y'all from this. This is a love poem of runaway slaves. Tangerine Tubman. Ringing out, the twilight doesn't stay soft for long. It sings out to the credulous, rerouting the curiosity of incredibly furious men, where us slivers of Africa migrate a telltale path. For such wayfarers, morning's for Salto is an unraveling ray, but with our feet to the wind, we are often the most fleet come midnight. Moon crickets on the lamb, bricks of gold on gifted wing. Boughs ache and crack, bearing this American weight, the brunt equity of hate and power, distributing a colossal mass, foreign in appraisal. Our heavy gods as the mask we wear, tutelary gods deemed ignoble by paled elite gradients. Our black frothy hair swaying disconnected from this specious heaven. Our bodies of light lost to flinching, the black identity breached until truth is contorted and clinging to dear life for tender pride. And it matters not which side of the bow, above or below, equilibrium always comes gleaning, a flabbergast leaching until you end and the gristle of you glistens in a bell jar. For 300 years, the electric branch resists corrosion, balancing and sponsor a commodity of shadows, a one-sided avarice versus the seeds of Kujichagulia. Harriet, do you hear me? I said I love you. Her eyes proffer the crepuscular hush fool as she raises off her hip, reading topography of sky, deciphering blueprint for our relay run, a wreath of thorns and chicken wire surrounding sunrise, halo for a long way to go. In this lean moment, dark eyes share discourse with constellations, each iris a perfectly tooled buckshot, drawing bead on morning acclivity where every sight and sound is strained or sieved through experience and instinct. Her eyes cast from the hardest of coals, and sometimes the softest. I dare you to unconvince me. Am I the fool for wanting with mouth waxing and actions waning? I move by her side, my grateful hand a crocus sack against her graceful hip, demanding the callous feel of crocus and buttercup. I am the fool. 200 feet off the plantation, and every broken nave reinvents nobility in past and present tense, proclaiming Harriet's invincibility to be his own creation, his brutally enslaved, self-inflicted sense of grandeur. There before the grace of God go, Harriet. Her iron hand forms an ancient vice across my mouth, a well-seasoned clamp of metal as biblical as a Passover. The plum of her palm a perfect muzzle, and I am shushed. A silence that mimics the fatal, but what is it she stifles? My brain or the brazen nonsense of notions burrowed beneath my brow until gushing. From the underbrush she rises and assumes the bard's position, my supernal caryatid squaring hips for soliloquy or prophecy, where buttstock is both pulpit and witness, black Moses in full zenith, each tooth striking flint, Beneath a delta of dark eyes, Harriet says to me, dare not think this small earthen patch is proper monument for our promises, raw and new, not ever for a moment. Large is life, and to love in it in incremental fragments is a fractured choice. This smallness is indeed a slave's acceptance, not the first link, but the latch in our chains. Previously hidden, the sun bubbles up like blood from a stone, a soft sponge heavy with Nile, cleansing what sores me, my soul swallowed by her wreath of hands, in which I'm finding too much comfort. Why can't we as well lounge in fondnesses, deprived of the circumstances for foreign ownership and its oversight? Harriet's eyes are quiver, see everything, all and at once, the sun and the shadowlands, the pain and the promises. Harriet is 7 moves ahead of Pitfall, the master strategist for stolen property. The underground's prima ballerina, our abolitional Marie Taglioni, dancing adagio through tobacco fields and high cotton, a crops de ballet.
Thank you. You know, it's wonderful to be at the Berry Center. They do this kind of work, but everything they do is special. 3 or 4 years ago, my friend Charlotte Green visited and gave me a copy of a letter I had sent to John Dunn, who then lived in Guatemala after her husband Richard died. And I thought, well, I'm going to read that at the Berry Center. Well, I didn't that year, and I didn't last year, and I'm going to read it this year. So, Sunday morning, 19th January, 1992. Dear John, sorry to have been so tongue-tied the night you called. I wasn't making much sense. I do want to tell you what happened and what was done. I think you want to know, and this will help me too. We started the week with snow and cold. School was called off. I was working in the shop. Jean at the house picked up the phone to make a call and heard Jordan trying to call the hospital party line. She sent Jesse down to tell me Richard had a head injury. I went right over. What had happened was that Richard was moving round bales to the pasture to feed. He had one chained to the front end loader, a scoop really, and had it raised too high on the chain. It slipped or something, and the bale fell into the tractor, down the lift arms, hitting Richard. He probably ducked into the steering wheel and rolled off the back of the tractor. Richard must have turned off the tractor and tried to step down. He was laying beside the tractor. Charlotte was beside him. Jordan had gone out and heard Richard call, sparking the rescue. Richard was awake, and it was not a head wound. He was having trouble breathing, but he was talking. He told us what happened, gave instructions on feeding the cows, said he goofed. What a damn fool he was for doing it. And something to Charlotte I didn't hear, and told me I would soon need to give mouth to mouth. He was trying to move where he could breathe better, and we were afraid for him to move. It seemed like it was taking forever for the life squad to get here. I think it really took them 12 minutes, a fast trip from Owenton. Richard was moving his legs and arms and talking and in great pain. Then he quit. I started mouth to mouth and did get air in his lungs. So I kept it up, and he did come back. This went on for about 3 minutes, and the ambulance arrived. A helicopter was called, and more folks were clearing a spot for landing at Ellis Market. It took a while to get him loaded, but he was still getting mouth to mouth, and care was taken to not worsen the injuries. Looking back, I think Richard really died there in Charlotte's arms, Alice and Jordan watching. But the folks in the ambulance all knew Richard, and no one was going to give it up. The ambulance went slowly to the market for transport to Lexington or Louisville. Charlotte asked if I would follow her there. I went home quickly to fill Jean in. In about 5 minutes, the helicopter came, but they couldn't get Richard stabilized. So it was decided to take him to Owington, a 3-minute copter ride. At this point, I felt, and Rafe said he did too, that Richard was dead. John, Richard's brother, took Charlotte and the kids to Owington, and I went to get Jean and followed. We had just gotten to the hospital when the doctor came out and told us there was nothing he could have done. It was around 12:45. A little over an hour had passed. Seemed like days. There was no one who wanted to be buried at home more than Richard. The Owen County Hospital was real broke up. The folks that had worked on Richard were in tears. And when we finally got it together to take over the body ourselves, there were nothing but help. Not at all like the red tape in Frankfurt when Tony died. Rafe and Teresa were there by now, and Rafe said he would make the coffin. My truck would be the hearse. We were going one step at a time and thinking sanely and together. I drove Richard home and went in to kick up the fire. While we were at the hospital, we were shown the x-rays. The damage was so massive, the doctor was surprised death wasn't instant, that not even the best of care could have saved him. Richard was now lying quietly in my truck. A lady from the school board came by with groceries right as Charlotte and the kids drove up. I didn't tell the lady Richard was just out in my truck. I thought she might flip. Alice and I put up the groceries, and Charlotte called her parents. Strength almost left us then, but some more folks came, and Kirk, Jean's brother, and Jean and our kids came, bringing hometown pizza, and John, Charlotte, me, Kirky, Alice, left a filling house to see Boone Webb about a grave in the Monterey Cemetery. Boone is old, and it was getting colder and blowing snow, so it took a while to get him to show us a landmark on his sheet of paper marking available plots. But we were able to pick a good one atop the hill without having to go up there. Jan Willoughby and Greg showed up before we left. They would dig the grave. Jan and Richard had dug graves together years ago, and Lauren and me and many others have spent hours digging up there. Now to bury the gravedigger. We picked out a spot close to Tony where there would be little rock. It turned out there were more than 15 people arriving the next morning to help dig. I've never seen a deeper grave with such straight sides. Charlotte figured out what to do next. We had already talked Charlotte and Jordan out of laying Richard out in the hay shed. John was wanting to get Richard cleaned up. I had earlier offered the shop. Kirk had offered his house, but Charlotte wanted him on the creek. So it was decided to bring him over here and clean him up in a place with running water. Dave Smith was now at the shop, and we cleaned up a spot just inside the garage door and went to get Richard. John and Jane Harriet and Teresa and Charlotte came with cloths and towels, and we cleaned him up and laid him out. Charlotte went home, and the night just went on. People arrived at Charlotte's, and many, came over to the press, and the wake was started. I must point out that Richard did not look himself. He was given so much air that all of it could not get to his lungs. The air had to go somewhere and really puffed Richard up. He was barely recognizable. People were warned, and many, as you can imagine, did not want or need to see Richard like this. There was much tears and stories and hugs and laughter and sorrow and drinking and gas. Reba and Jerry Bessinger stayed with Richard that night. The next morning, I covered Richard with a cloth. He was looking a bit rough. Jane and Teresa and Leslie brought flowers and cut cedar and pine branches and candles and incense, and the place looked good. I felt we were going to make it until Lauren came and lifted the cloth and gave a death howl. We all broke up again. But we got it together. Margaret, Richard's mother, and his two sisters were flying up from Florida. Charlotte's parents were snowed in Illinois, but they got here, and so did her sisters and brother. Rafe and Al and Pat Kennedy and Jerry were making the coffin, made with wide old poplar boards, trimmed in cedar, with a walnut board as decoration. Master craftsmanship. And they finished right at dark and brought it over. Margaret, Larry, John, Dave, Marshall Thompson, and me patted the bottom with cedar chips and laid down a plaid cloth and laid Richard in, filling under the cloth and around the body with more cedar. We arranged cedar and pine branches atop Richard to his waist and put the lid on. We were doing okay, but there was a lot of deep breaths. We did not know it, but people were waiting outside for us to finish, and now they started to come in. The press filled, our house filled. There was no parking. People who were leery of coming to this wake went away thinking, what a sane way of dealing with death. Jordan wished to have a bonfire, and one burned through the night. Food and drink kept coming. We made coffee pot after pot. Somewhere in here, you called. God knows how you found out. Word spread faster than I thought was capable. Lauren and Pat stayed with Richard this night. The funeral was to be at 11 at the Christian church, and we got there around 10. It was already so packed, it was hard getting the coffin through the crowd to the front of the church. People were standing everywhere. A crowd was even outside in the bitter wind. Kirky and Alice lit the candles, and we tried to sing and listen and folks talk about Richard. All red-eyed. Charlotte requested we all take communion. This took a while with so many folks. It was all just right. Afterwards, we went to the cemetery. Many walked and prayed and said the Lord's Prayer, and all who wanted threw in a shovelful of dirt. I'd say no one threw in more than 5 shovelfuls. and not everyone was able to get their chance at the shovel before the grave was filled. They said it was dug faster than it was filled. People sang and cried and told stories and shook in the cold. Then we all went to Leslie's house and spent the rest of the day. Saturday, Charlotte was getting a lot of help from her family. Her parents are still staying at our house. Teresa and Maureen have others, and has been holding up well. Jordan and Alice have their friends and family around them all the time. Hudson and Hugh Archer have offered lawyering services. A lot of folks have given cash. It's not okay, but it couldn't be any better. We've done right by Richard, and we've done right by ourselves. Give yourself a hug from me and from all of us. You just never know. Thank you.
I really appreciate all you fellas. I really appreciate being here. Appreciate being in this place. I'm going to do you a little something out of my second book, which is called Weed Eater. It's the orange one, if you're... I was about finished mowing out in the side yard that evening when Belinda Coates pulled up in front of that woman's house in her pink Camaro. I was hoping maybe when I got done, me and that woman would get a chance to talk about how hot it was or how I got one of my injuries, just whatever she wanted to talk about. She had the quietest ways, that woman did. She only wore colors you'd see in the woods, and when she moved her hands, it's like watching birds settle on a phone wire. I liked how there wasn't no ruckus to her, so I was hoping Belinda Coates would leave her alone. Belinda Coates wasn't nothing but ruckus. Belinda Coates was short and solid and would have been nice looking if she wasn't such a terror. You'd probably recognize her from the paper or the detention center website. She didn't have no mother, no father, not that I ever heard of, and she mostly stayed with her Uncle Sidney, who kept his name out of the paper fairly well, but we all knew was pretty much behind everything bad they ever put in the paper, and a fair amount of other bad as well. Belinda sat in that gaudy mess of a car she drove, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel and checking her mirrors. I knew that woman was in the house, but there wasn't no way I would tell Belinda Coates that. I thought about mowing so the grass would throw on Belinda Coates' vehicle. I thought that might make her leave. But more likely, she'd just start something up with me, which I didn't have no interest in. I'd done my share of arguing and making the horses behind to myself, and I was trying my level best to steer clear as such. I was weed eating under a weeping cherry tree, and Belinda Coates started blowing her car horn, and that woman and her yellow dog come out on the screened-in porch to see what was going on. And I knew that woman thought highly of me because I stopped to drink a pop. She had asked me, would I be interested in feeding that dog and taking it for walks when she was gone. That woman didn't have no man nor kids, not that I could see, and it seemed that dog was near everything to her. I guess somebody who'd had it before had beat on it and tied it up and left it when they moved away, and that woman had saved it. And so she prized it, even though it looked like every other yellow dog you'd ever seen. Belinda Coates took a break from blowing her car horn when she seen that woman on the porch. Belinda Coates started hollering, Trisha Jewell, if you know what's good for you, you'll get your ass down here. And that woman did a lot of cleaning up on her sister Trisha's house. I know because I helped her do it. We packed clothes soaked in toilet water and broken glass and just plain filth down them steps for days. And when that woman had them haul up some of her furniture from Tennessee to put up in that place, I helped pack that stuff up them steps too. That woman come out from that screened-in porch and started down the steps, and when she did, Belinda Coates yelled up at her, "Who the hell are you?" And when Belinda Coates did that, the yellow dog stood up on its hind legs so it could see out the porch screen and started barking hard as it could go. Reared up like a person, barks booming out over town like the tornado siren. That woman tried to hush the yellow dog, but she couldn't. She come down a few more steps and said, "I'm June. I'm Trisha's sister. What's your name?" And I had stopped weed eating by then and was standing sideways on the hill facing them. one leg higher up the hill than the other. Hard to stand like that, steep as it was. And Belinda Coates said, "Don't you worry who I am." I said, "Where's Tricia?" And that woman come down some more, about 12 steps between her and Belinda Coates. That woman sat down and collected and calm and said, "She ain't here, honey. I don't know where she is. I wish I did." Belinda Coates come around the front of her car and she put her hand on the wall at the base of the steps. And she said, "I don't believe you. You're lying. You're just another lying jewel." And I stepped closer, still packing my weed eater. And that woman said, "I ain't a jewel, but I do wish I was lying." "Tricia Jewel got my daddy thrown in jail," Belinda Coates said. Belinda Coates was talking about her uncle, Sidney Coates. "She got him thrown in jail and got his money confiscated because she's a rat snitch, and when I find her, she's a dead rat snitch. Said my daddy sold her pills, and he never did. Never sold her pill one." And that woman started punching buttons on her cordless phone, and that's when Belinda Coates come up on the steps and slapped the phone out of that woman's hand. The phone went flying, and Belinda Coates busted that woman right in the side of her face, and that woman tried to stand up, but Belinda Coates pushed her back down. I was still a ways away, and there was a unruly hedge between me and them, but I didn't care because Belinda Coates smacked that woman in the face again, this time with her other hand on the other side of that woman's face. And I said, "Hey, you wait right here." And I headed over there because, see, I had a notion I'd make a good hero for that woman. So I said, "Hey," again, and then when Belinda Coates got a handful of that woman's hair and started yanking that woman down the steps, I said, "You stop that now." And stepped right onto my weed eater and went chin first into them steps. And when I tried to get up, my feet went out from under me. And I went tumbling down that woman's hill, and that woman shouted, and I imagined it's because of me. But more likely it was where Belinda Coates was flailing her. But whichever it was, I went over the edge of that wall, which was about 4-foot drop, and landed right on my forehead on the sidewalk in front of that woman's house. And my forehead split open like one of them TV wrestlers, and I sat up and wiped the blood out of my eyes, and I seen a man from the waterworks grab a hold of Belinda Coates, and it surprised me how the bald of his head looked like the head of the lawyer, lived next door to where my sister did before she shot herself the morning of Easter past. Me trying to get in her locked kitchen door, my arm all bloody through the broken glass of the deadbolt, her all tore up because her husband was gone on pills and had took up with this girl they had known in high school who was also gone on pills. And I begged my sister not to do it, her with the gun in her mouth, her who had fixed my meals my whole life, had got me little jobs and made brother take me on, who read my stuff for me, who begged me to stay out of them payday loan places. And I told sister I couldn't do without her. And she shot herself anyway. And when she did, I had gone to that bald lawyer's house, and his wife looked at me through the locked storm door glass and said, "Gene, what's the matter?" And I said, "I need some help with sister." As it was, the waterworks man held Belinda Coates by one arm while he got the police on that woman's cordless. That woman saying, "No, no, no, we don't need the police, no, no, no." In my head, light as dried grass, on that dog barking like if it didn't, that woman would tie her up and move off. And that woman's beautiful bathtub eyes telling me she didn't need me to be her hero, and that I wasn't ever going to be no more to her than the man who mowed the yard. But that didn't mean she didn't need me. That didn't mean that I was useless.
I had to go the long way around to get here. That could be the beginning of something. Thank you so much to everyone who made this possible. And it's such a joy to be here and to hear these amazing words. I'm working on a new book of poems called New Way, which was the name of my daddy's cleaners, dry cleaners in Harlan. And every section is introduced by a dream. So I'm going to read just the first 2 poems. I fell on the stairs between Michigan and Florida. You didn't know there were stairs? Ah, traveler, always more journeys than maps. And this is hairpin. Once, when the car stopped working just like that, somewhere on 25E, my mother coasted to a stop beside the road, pulled the release handle, got out and lifted the hood. She leaned over the engine as if it were a brooder full of chicks, then took a bobby pin from somewhere in her hair and put it where something told her it should go. Back in, she turned the key. At first, it sounded like the engine wouldn't turn over. What does that even mean? But then it caught. She drove the 30 miles or so home and went straight to the Texaco. Frank Gurgley came out to meet us. "What can I do for you, Gladys?" "I'm not sure," she said. "Could you check the engine? It quit on me down around Artemis." "Pop the hood," he said, then went to look in. In a few minutes, he came back to her window. "Well, for starters, you've got a hairpin in the carburetor." You can't make that stuff up. I'm going to read a picture book illustrated by Catherine Tillotson. This book came out in 2011, which means I probably was working on it in 2008, 2009. So there are ways in which it is outdated. You'll recognize that. All the water in the world is all the water in the world. Water flows from the hose. It wobbles in blue pools. It fills your cup up. But where does it come from? Water doesn't come, it goes around. That rain that cascaded from clouds and meandered down mountains, that wavered over waterfalls, then slipped into rivers and opened into oceans, that rain has been here before. Thirsty air licks it from lakes, sips it from ponds, guzzles it from oceans. And this wet air swirls up till it's crowded into clouds, where it hangs hotly around till cool air bumps through. And honey, those clouds, just let it go and rain, rain, rain. Tap dance, avalanche, stampede of drips and drops and drumming, a wealth of water. But far away, not so far away now, it's a different day. No sound but wind, empty cup again. Dry grasses rustle, dirt's just dust. Everything waits for an open gate in a wall of clouds, for rain sweet and loud to fill the well and start the stream. Honey, living things dream of water. For all to drink, use in tub or sink. Wash in, splash in. This wet wonder means grow, means life will flow through tigers, through trees, through you and through me. all together now. All so precious, do not waste it, and delicious, we can taste it. Keep it clear, keep it clean, keep earth green. And the dedication is for Pete Seeger, Wendell Berry, Gurney Norman, and all who have worked to save the water of life, and for Bernie Stoddard, who is just learning to swim in it. And I'm going to end with a poem I wrote in 2008 when we were in a financial crisis. The meadow does not know about the stock market. Today, she is worth exactly what she was worth yesterday, a year ago, at creation. I don't mean property value, taxable assets. I mean milkweed and copper moths, honeybees, cowvetch, king snakes. Meadow life is not money. What rises and falls here are stems and flowers, leaves and fruit. No zigzag line of profit and panic, but the great wheel turning. Here God gives of her extravagance, and here, like flicker, viceroy, dragonfly, we come into our inheritance. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all. I'm so glad to be here. I'm always honored to be in the presence of Tanya and Wendell Berry and Mary Berry and everybody that's involved in the Berry Center doing such important work. I do have to begin with an apology. I have to run right out as soon as I read because I am headed to Western Kentucky to speak to the Sierra Club, which Mary Berry did exactly a year ago today, so I'm glad to follow in her footsteps. But thank you. But I'm sad I don't get to hear the rest of the readers. I'm working on a book of poetry right now. I've been working on it a couple of years, and it's sort of has an element of memoir to it, and my aunt shows up quite a bit in it. So I'm going to read 4 poems, and the first 2 are about her. And you will see that she often uses a cigarette to punctuate her declarations. This is called At the Opening of Coal Miner's Daughter, Corbin, Kentucky, March 27th, 1980. The line snaked down the sidewalk all the way to the grocery store. People stomped their feet to stay warm, and plumes of white puffed out of their mouths. When snow started falling, a little murmur of joy escaped the crowd. My aunt, Sis, was not fazed by the cold. She drew hard on her Winston and eyed me, leaning down. Blue eyeshadow, chipped fingernail polish, hands warmed by waitressing and too much loving and factory work. Are you froze to death, baby? Yes, I was. I didn't care if it was Loretta Lynn. Why did we have to wait so long? Sis plucked the cigarette from her lips and looked me right in the eye. Because, she said, she is one of us. Before that, I had never known there was an us and a them, but ever since, the world has been divided in 2. This is called Ghost, and it has an epigraph. Grief never goes away. It might change shape, but it always has its teeth in us. And that's from Alison Moyer. Ghost. Hours after she died, I was shocked to find myself in the kitchen floor, howling in pain. I had never known grief could become physical, something that lurks in your guts, uncurls, and demands to be let loose. 7 years later, and sometimes her scent still cuts the air. Cigarettes and Elizabeth Arden Red Door perfume. 7 years later, and still I pick up the phone to call her. 7 years later, and I can't watch her on film. Her presence in motion conjures too tangible an absence. But often I put on the songs she loved the most. Night Moves, and He Stopped Loving Her Today, Wild and Blue, or Don't Let Our Love Start Slipping Away. I want to wail the way I did in those first days, but I don't anymore. Other times I dance, imagining her there, eyes closed, lost to music. I used to believe in ghosts. These days I don't. She would be one if she could. She would jump out and scare me if she was able. She would throw her head back and laugh with her mouth open before firing up a Winston Light and savoring every draw and exhalation. She would be a smoking ghost, one whose only sound is the critch of the metal wheel on her red Bic. She only visits me in dreams, and there she never talks. We walk together along the lake bank. She bends, chooses the perfect rock, skips it across the calm, green water. The waves are so gentle, I can't hear them supping at the shore. The quiet we share in these reveries is the opposite of lament. I was really lucky to grow up in southeastern Kentucky, and I grew up near Cumberland Falls. If you haven't been there, I hope you'll go. It's truly one of our wonders of Kentucky. And this poem is about the way, for lots of people, especially LGBT people, a wild place can be a safe place. And it also has an epigraph from Gerard Manley Hopkins, "Oh, let them be." This is called Cumberland Falls. In high school, the biggest dare was to slink over the slick rocks flanking Cumberland Falls, where the wide but shallow river dives 70 feet into a deep pool of froth. There, people say, catfish big as men twist and slither, awaiting suppers sped their way. You can see a rainbow at night, shimmering on the mist during a full moon and a clear sky. This is true. I snuck behind the green curtain once with my best friend, whose name I won't say because he never came out. Just as we reached the veil of water where we would disappear into another world, I slipped. My right leg slid down the cold boulder, and before I could plunge into the churning chaos where torrent met river, he grabbed hold of my hand. I was so electrified by his touch, I didn't think of how close I was to being swept away. Instead, I thought how a small moment of ecstasy is akin to drowning. He held on for a beat longer than necessary. The roar behind the falls was a deafening symphony, heard only by those brave enough to penetrate this darksome cavern carved by centuries. Fern-laden, alive with the smell of moss, a secret cathedral made of wildness and wet. We were mesmerized and stood watching the cascade as if frozen, yet as if we might see through to the other side. Thank you. I'll close with a sad one. I like to keep it dark. This is called For You Who Have Loved Old Dogs, and it's for my friend John Lackey. Old Andy is a big dog, black as a night sky in the most lonesome winter months. He is fat, even though he doesn't eat much these days. His man is one of the best folks I know. They were hiking deep in the high mountains when good Andy's back legs stopped their work. The old dog folded himself down on the path, his eyes lighting on his man's to apologize. My friend carried him nearly a mile, this great sprawl of blessed animal who must have lain in his arms both thankful and ashamed. They collapsed together at the end of the steep trail, holding on to each other, exhausted. I am thankful for you who take care of old dogs. I'm glad you have one another when you need a friend the most, that you've had times of stillness watching the world, that you know the grace of silence together. I thank the infinite eternity and the God of my understanding for people like you who carry them when they need you. 3 times now, I've held an old dog in my arms as they left me. 3 times, I felt their heartbeats fade away on my palm, witnessing a shooting star become more darkness. The end. All is lost and gone. I've grieved for each of them just as much as I have for people I've loved, maybe more, because the grief gets acknowledged so much less. I have carried it with me, a heft I wish I did not have to bear, but one that I will cherish now. The burden of my empty arms is the greatest weight. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, you guys just keep coming back every year. This is a special place. It's hard not to be here. I'm going to try not to cough through these poems. I'm going to read some new work for you. Some of it will make you uncomfortable because it's about Kentucky / and the Civil War. But it tries to fill in some blanks and sum up the story from a different point of view. And some of these are dark, so, I mean, it's the Civil War, so, right? The opening poem is called Truth Be Told. Kentuckians, I believe, remember too much of former selves, another life. Antique stores line our main streets and broadways. So many interactions swell with aches older than the moment. Violence erupts with so little provocation. Old wounds fester. Scores are settled, not forgiven. Whichever ancestor's blood speaks loudest seems to govern our passions when we meet. Yet generational traumas stay hushed. Minds set firm around color and class. Mob behavior and guns, always the guns. It is as if so much blood was spilled here. Our most sacred ground is still dark and wet. So we'll be open in that dark place. Many of you are familiar with Margaret Garner / Beloved, at least the movie version if you didn't read the book, from Toni Morrison's amazing work. This poem tries to tell another side of Margaret Garner's story. This is a story of the woman who escaped with her family into Cincinnati, and then when almost captured with her family, she cuts her 2-year-old daughter's throat and ends up on trial in Cincinnati for several weeks. And part of the challenge is if she can be proven to have murdered a human being or if she just destroyed property. That's the focus of the headlines in the newspapers, but there's another story beneath that. This is called Testify, in the voice of Margaret Garner. Look at me and my swollen belly. Look at my pale, pale skin. Look at the scar across my face. Don't call me murderer. My slave name is next. Look at my children. You think they look like Master Gaines too? Step back from all this. Stop eyeballing me and the sharp, sharp blade. Take a closer look at the white men. The older Gaines, who is also my daddy, sold me to his brother, which means my uncle has kept me barefoot and with child since I was barely 15. I got 3 at my waist, 1 on my hip and 1 more in my belly right now. But don't count the children. Look at the scars on my face. These ain't from my husband's hand. I spared my baby girl not from this life, but from my life. You saw how much she looked like me. Half the lawyers think this whole trial be about murder, but if we be people or property. But it'd take another woman like Miss Lucy to understand that it really be about something else, something much worse than taking a life or acknowledging one. About making a woman's body your smokehouse and your root cellar. About believing her sour, sour plum is your fresh fruit. That's all I got to say. All right, this one is a little more uplifting. You may have seen the movie Glory, and it's about the 54th Regiment, the first volunteer African-American soldiers in the Civil War who got the chance to see battle. But in that movie, Frederick Douglass gets most of the credit for encouraging the governor to form that regiment. But it was actually Lewis Hayden who lived in Lexington, Kentucky, and escaped on the Underground Railroad and ended up coming back from Canada and settled in Boston, who became friends with the would-be governor who played that significant role. So this is a poem in the voice of Lewis Hayden, who had 2 sons. One was sold away when he was still in Lexington. He never saw again. The second one died as a naval soldier in the Civil War. So this is called Because I Am a Man, the voice of Lewis Hayden. Enslavement taught me that our dead son's cold grave would always yield more peace than the horror forced upon us by the ghost of the one who was sold away forever. Because I am a man with conviction, when we escaped Lexington through stations in Ohio on to Canada, it only seemed right to become part of the same system that provided shelter and protection to us and to aid as many journeys as possible to freedom. Because I am a man with no son I can ever touch again. Our Boston boarding house was more than a way station. It was a chance to feed bowls of freedom soup, followed by our first ever night's peaceful rest to every size and color refugee child smuggled to our door and tucked in like our own kith and kin. Because I am a man still tormented by loss and unafraid of death, I keep a keg of dynamite tied to a long fuse in my basement. Freedom, yours and mine, is a right I would gladly pay for with my life because I am a man. Lewis Hayden. All right, a couple more. I'll close with some soldier poems, but I want to read this poem about my complicated relationship with a song, my old Kentucky home. And this is called Why I Don't Stand. And it's, if you look at it on the page, it's 2 pieces of documents kind of forced together to make a single poem. And the other document is an ad for the purchase of African bodies. And it was printed and distributed in Lexington in the same year that the song, as our state song, was written. So, Why I Don't Stand. Apologies for the part that should sound like a song but won't. Oh, the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes 'tis summer, the darkies are gay. The undersigned wishes to purchase a large lot of Negroes. Well, corn tops ripe for the New Orleans market, and the meadows in the bloom. I will pay $1,200 to $1,250 for #1 young men and $850 to $1,000 for #1 young women, while the birds make music all the day. In fact, I will pay more than for likely Negroes. Weep no more, my lady. Oh, weep no more today than any other trader in Kentucky. We sing one song. My office is adjoining the Broadway Hotel for my old Kentucky home. On Broadway, Lexington, Kentucky, for my old Kentucky home far away, where I or my agent can always be found. All right, I'm going to close with 2 poems from soldier's point of view. And this next one I'll read because for a second it might sound like there's something funny in it. This is called Bird Watching, and it's tribute to when I was researching these poems, my friend Ed Hamilton gave me a casting of an eagle that was taken from an authentic Civil War uniform that he used on his own monument that's in U Street in Washington, D.C. So this is called Bird Watching. It's in the voice of Sergeant Major Charles Singer, who was a freedman who joined the U.S. Colored Infantry from Covington, Kentucky. Bird Watching, Major Charles Singer. I was an educated man and free from Covington, Kentucky, before I was mustered into the infantry. Many of my fellow soldiers spent time around the fire or on guard duty, debating the intricacies of our uniforms, especially the itch of wool, the tight shoes, and the placement of eagles everywhere. I have eloquently defended the majesty and the fierceness of the beautiful bald eagle, especially the large one we wear across our shoulder strap. To many an old soldier, fresh out of bondage, the proud bird looking backwards hearkens to the African Sankofa, a powerful reminder to learn from our mistakes. But the younger, more skeptical brethren who questioned and challenged everything said that they only loved one bird, the chicken, roasted, and refused to even shine their eagles because they believed that in the heat of battle, it's just a big target in the center of their chests. Later, in the dark, I consider all that was said, rub my thumb across the set of wings on my breastplate, and wonder which one of us is wrong. This next poem is, wish I can find it, is kind of a challenge because it actually appears in 3 columns on the page. The first column are the instructions from the sergeant about how to load and shoot a rifle. The second column are the actual physical actions the body takes to perform this feat. And the third column is kind of an inner dialogue that I imagine this particular soldier is having while he's performing this feat. It was inspired by, there's a scene in the movie Glory where the sergeant is firing a pistol in the ear of a would-be soldier, and he's not able to complete the task because there's just too much stress in that moment. So I tried to wonder what it would take for him to complete that task. So I'll read it 2 versions so that I don't lose you, and it tries to have a chance to make sense. It's called Load in 9 Times. Load, sit butt of musket on the ground. Handle cartridge, pull paper cartridge from the box. Tear cartridge, use teeth to rip top off. Charge cartridge, put gunpowder in his mouth, add round. Ram cartridge, pull metal rod from gun, push it down the throat of musket. Return rammer, return metal rod. Prime, cock gun and seat cap. Shoulder arms, wait for orders. Ready, squeeze the trigger. Aim, fire. That's the first version. The second one, I'll skip that second and put the first and third columns together. Load, I wonder. Handle cartridge, if I look down. Tear cartridge, the business end. Charge cartridge of my musket. Ram cartridge and see old massa. Return rammer, standing there. Prime, if I will hesitate. Shoulder arms, or remember. Ready, how many times? Aim, he beat my wife. Fire! Thank you.
Sitting here thinking about something Robert Gipe said. Said everybody wants a writers' conference till the writers show up. So thank you, Virginia, for intrepidly inviting us all here. I'm going to read 2 passages from Clear Creek. This is basically a series of entries that follow the course of a year. They sort of wander all over the place. What I'm going to read is about several things. One thing it's about is about my grandfather. He was a country preacher who made life pretty hard for his children. A child of the Depression, my grandfather was a saver who owned very few possessions. My mother always assumed that since my father, my grandfather's son, had committed suicide when I was 3, my grandparents were banking their money to leave to me and my uncle. I suppose she thought of it as a kind of reparation payment to make up for my missing father. But toward the end of his life, my grandfather gave all of his savings to missionaries working to stamp out paganism in South America. This development drove my uncle, already a brittle man, into a vertiginous feeling of betrayal from which he never really recovered. But as someone with pagan tendencies myself, something my grandfather probably suspected, I wouldn't have felt right accepting his patrimony, though I probably would have, and I never gave much thought to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that bypassed me like a Cessna disappearing into the Amazon jungle. After my grandfather's funeral service, I went back to his Bayside house, a 13-sided structure on stilts that we all called the Roundhouse, and emptied a half pint of bourbon into a coffee cup. I sipped the warm liquor in bed while I listened to my uncle fume about my grandfather's will out in the main room of the house. Then I fell asleep to olfactory dreams triggered by the salty air sweeping in from the bay. The next morning when I packed, I placed in my bag the one thing I would take to remember my grandfather, that cup. Then I left his home in Tidewater, Virginia, and never went back. Still, I've taken great care of my grandfather's cup with its strange blue flowers, and I drink my own coffee from it every morning. The money that my grandfather gave went to fund this movie about Jesus' life in Spanish. It starred all Spanish soap opera actors, and it was meant to be shown all over South America. I was lucky a couple summers ago to go to the Galapagos Islands, which is 100 miles off the coast of Ecuador, to do some research. And everywhere in the Galapagos, there's these little mini markets, and they all look exactly the same. They have exactly the same stuff, except there's like one corner that's just a mashup of all kinds of things. So I'm like buying some water, and I see these like bright pink women's underwear, like out the corner of my eye, and they say something outrageous on them. So I go over there thinking I'll take a picture of this to send to my wife. And above the underwear is the DVD of the movie my grandfather gave all of my inheritance to pay for. So you think about it, I mean, it's like 500 miles out there in the middle of the ocean. So, you know, it's doing something. Daunting me. Okay, this is about my uncle. This passage takes place on Martin Luther King Day, when I decide to reread Letter from Birmingham Jail. The events of Birmingham and Letter from Birmingham Jail is like the most perfect example of how to make a sane argument in an insane time. Go home and read it. The events in Birmingham in 1963 crystallized for King the necessity of nonviolent civil disobedience over simply making moral appeals to the consciences of Southern whites. If you create enough tension, you attract attention to your cause, King reasoned. And it was the events in Birmingham that finally got the attention of John and Robert Kennedy and led to the March on Washington later that year. A year earlier, students at Miles College organized a boycott of Birmingham's downtown businesses because they refused to hire black people or let them sit at lunch counters. As president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King was frustrated that since the Montgomery bus boycott, he had not been able to secure for his cause the attention of the national media or even the majority of what he called white moderates. Birmingham looked like an opportunity to dramatize the humiliations of segregation and the need for federal civil rights legislation. Under the sway of the Ku Klux Klan, the city had become so violent that black residents referred to it as Bombingham. A movement quickly formed there with the goal of abolishing discriminatory hiring while desegregating lunch counters, restrooms, and fitting rooms. During a demonstration on April 7th, Birmingham's Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, unleashed snarling German shepherds onto the crowd. The city convinced a circuit judge to issue an injunction against all future marches or protests. On Good Friday, an apprehensive King appeared before his fellow SCLC lieutenants in overalls, prepared to be arrested. The small group began walking towards the city hall in what King called a prayer pilgrimage, but 4 blocks into the march, a paddy wagon appeared and everyone was carted off to jail, where King was placed in solitary confinement and prevented from communicating with his lawyers. So instead, he got down to work on a long letter. There are actually 2 versions of King's letter. The longer one, the one I'm reading now, appeared in his book, Why We Can't Wait, and it levels much more condemnation at the white church than does the original. In it, he remembers many ministers rationalizing their acquiescence to segregation by saying, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern, a position that, as James Baldwin knew, ignores basically everything Jesus taught. And King admits in the later version that when he drove past beautiful churches in the South, he wondered, who worships here? Who is their God? I think about my grandfather's church in rural Achilles, Virginia. It was a plain brick structure with a high white steeple. When I was a child, my mother and I went to visit my grandparents after the death of my father. The 2 of us would play a game of who could spot the steeple first above the tall Virginia pines. At the back of the church's baptistry was an inept rendering of a thoroughly Anglicanized Jesus, and the plaster walls of the sanctuary were as white as its congregation. When I got older and my grandfather was retired from preaching, he revealed to me his decades-old plan of what he would have done had a black person attempted to worship at the First Baptist Church of Achilles. I simply would have said the benediction and dismissed the congregation immediately. I can't remember what my response to that was, but I'm sure it's nothing that would have impressed Dr. King. When my uncle, my father's brother, died in 2007, there were few mourners at the funeral and fewer at the graveside. My uncle had been mentally ill for a long time and had finally driven away or abandoned his few friends. My grandparents were dead, and most of their friends who might have attended had also passed away. I myself was out of the country, but my mother tells me that as she and my stepfather watched the casket lowered, a car she didn't recognize pulled up. 2 black women, one in her 60s, the other her adult daughter, approached the grave. They said a prayer. My parents looked on but said nothing. After the interment was complete, the older woman took my mother aside and told her that 30 years earlier, she and my Uncle Dan had been lovers. After my father died, my grandfather decided that my grandmother needed something to do with her grief. So he set her up as the director of the Friendship House, a Baptist-affiliated organization that offered after-school and summer programming for children of color in a poor part of Newport News. My grandmother had an office on the third floor of the large old house and basically oversaw the books and signed checks. My uncle started volunteering at the Friendship House as well. That's where he met Mary. They started to see each other on the sly, or at least unbeknownst to my grandparents and the rest of our family. Then Mary got pregnant. She and Dan went to see my grandfather at his church office. They told him the situation and said they wanted to get married. No one in the family knows exactly what my grandfather said to them. We do know that he forbade it. He convinced Dan and Mary that such a union would jeopardize his own position as pastor of a white church in conservative rural Virginia. Dan was, of course, a full-grown man who didn't need his father's consent for anything. But my grandfather wielded the same psychic power, the same domineering force over my uncle that he did over my father. Dan backed down, acquiesced. Mary said she was going to have the baby anyway. My grandfather paid her off. He purchased a house for her. Maybe there were other payments along the way as well. My mother isn't sure. But we do know Dan kept seeing Mary and her daughter for years to come. My mother said it suddenly made sense to her why at every family holiday my uncle left immediately after dinner and didn't return until well into the early morning. Finally, Mary gave Dan an ultimatum: either marry her or forfeit any more opportunities to see his daughter. But Dan, who we know was in love with Mary, couldn't do it. He couldn't step up. The specter of my grandfather's disapproval was still too much, still too debilitating. Mary and her daughter moved away from Newport News, settled in South Carolina. Mary told my mother that she never saw my uncle again. But like my father, he began to fall apart. He signed up for the Coast Guard, but during a training exercise, Dan dove into a pool and refused to rise to the surface. Divers had to drag his body out to resuscitate him. He was discharged. Other suicide attempts followed. My grandmother was understandably frantic that she might lose another son, but my grandfather began to build a distance between himself and Dan. In his mind, the wrong son had died, and the surviving one had only been a disappointment. I know this because my grandfather never tried to hide it, never tried to assure Dan of any filial affection. My uncle became more and more erratic. He couldn't hold jobs, and he began to exhibit the same bipolar behavior that plagued his brother, my father. For decades to come, his doctors never succeeded in finding the right combination of medications to quiet his demons. Once he disappeared for months and was found wandering a roadside in Arizona, unrecognizable to himself. So Dan wouldn't end up homeless. My grandmother drew one concession from my grandfather, that he bequests to Dan their house in their will. My grandfather did that and nothing more. Dan did marry late in life and was supported by his wife's pension, and then he died. And then the woman my grandfather wouldn't let him marry appeared at his grave. Then just as quickly, she and her daughter disappeared from our lives. When I visited Dan's grave years later, I caught sight of the white cross that still sits atop the white steeple of the church my grandfather once pastored. Who worships there, I wonder? Who is their God? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for sticking around, and thank you, Virginia, Mary, and Wendell, and Tanya for hosting this great gathering. I'm going to read from the new book, Licks. We each were given 3 licks for throwing snowballs against the side of the school and making them stick. It snowed so rarely we didn't know what snow could do. Lessons were over, but we were lingering outside before we walked the alleyway and the field where our tracks in the snow would jumble together and then untangle on our way home. I had the farthest way to go, but not so far, and a paper route and other chores before the dark. Homework was nowhere in my mind. I was trying to make a face on the wall, but it just looked like a bunch of blotches. That was all right with me, though. I liked the blotchy white against the brick. It looked like several moons were stranded in the cold universe of the wall. The principal said we'd broken a rule, but we didn't know the rule existed. Our protest sailed over his head. The principal said we were lying now and he was going to light us up. So that's what he did. 3 licks each. A horse in a painting over his desk where we had to bend and place our hands was supposed to wink with every lick. Whipping a boy with a wooden paddle doesn't always change his mind about the universe or snow. It wasn't exactly the plank of reason, that paddle on which we signed our names, a record the principal liked to keep, and there wasn't much principle behind it, and it didn't even hurt that much. The school where that happened, Frank and I both attended. Planting trees in God's country. My people sought down, they say, 200 years before the beginning of time, being kicked out of the place where they had been, never to prosper there, only to toil. And here, in deep woods and on hills steep and rugged and rocky, they made a hill farm, not to prosper, but in quiet hope to survive, to plant in the ground and feed themselves. And that meant clearing a patch of land, cutting the trees, breaking the dark original canopy in violence to let the sunlight reach the ground. All for a little corn and beans, surrounded by the first beauty. If this was done unthinkingly without a measure of regret, I do not know. I have my thoughts. We have to live with ignorance, even painfully our own. We also have to imagine the past and believe we come from it, not to undo it, but simply to imagine and therefore belong by opening the ground. And then imagine shade in summer coming to this place again, and birdsong in the branches of heaven-reaching trees, living ladders stuck in the ground to give the future another rung of its past. The invitation is to climb. One thing I know about God's country, it's all there is, and it's supposed to be alive. The garden. I was down there pulling weeds from my patch and noticed my fingers had all turned green. I had a green blur at the end of each arm and my favorite hue of green with brightness in it. It's wonderful to learn what you can make of yourself, to see what you become. I think it happens if you just let life be life. It'll take you along with it. I became a man with green hands. I hadn't thought about it much, but I'd decided to let life be life, and my life would be inside it. Why wouldn't I be glad of that? After I'd gotten good and green, I raised my arms and held them up and pretended to be a giant bug with a green glob at the end of its feelers. But soon I went back to being a man with green hands bent over the patch. And I knew it was the patch that made me, the instilling green of the garden patch whose rose I'd tried to define, only to be myself defined as life led me, being the life, a green thought in a green shade, and that is how a world was made. Chicken bristle. There's a place near here called Chicken Bristle. It's not a very hopeful name, but it's out in the country and quiet. A handful of houses are clustered along a lane. The land is rolling and secret and dark. My grandmother lived there when she was a girl, but then it was known as Turnersville, if you were white. If you were black, you lived in Chicken Bristle, Kentucky. I've seen a map that says the place is Turnersville, but then a pair of parentheses has Chicken Bristle between the crescent moon-like curves. The curves are like unspoken verses, and Chicken Bristle is more than a name. I don't think anyone, black or white, prospered there. It was just a place to live and long and love your people. It wasn't a place for prospering. And anyway, enriching yourself with simple riches isn't really prosperity. It's better to know the land around you is rolling and dark, pastoral and lulling and hard. You set your mind and body to work and hope the work will reach your heart to see in that repose some beauty, some meaning for a human life. And there you have it, America, your history in brief. I think you need to live and long and love your people. I'm writing this poem while my daughter sleeps in quiet peace, only the sound of my pen scratching its marks on the page, her whistling breath. It's late in the night. One of these days I'm going to take her to Chicken Bristle and hold her up to the air in the wild and say to her, part of you, my love, comes from Chicken Bristle, this dark and lulling place sprung up like a thistle patch among the hills. But isn't it beautiful? Isn't there sweetness in the very air? This is the last one I'll read. Some of you may know we recently lost Loyal Jones, certainly the grandfather of Appalachian literary studies. He was also a great chronicler of humor. So I wrote this for him, but fortunately he was alive, so I could share it with him. Translation. So I came out of my rainy bower covered with white petals dropped from a tree. My people long ago, whose milky eyes I still can see, would have said I had a God's plenty of petals on me. An expression I liked to hear as a boy because I knew it pointed out the obvious, only to make it just like that, completely something else. But those people are gone away from the world, so I had to say it myself. The God's plenty of petals that fell when the little rain came down and I happened to be under the tree. I have no idea what plenty is to God, but it riddles my heart to know that someone thought about it once, probably after a day's work, when he was staring at a lantern or sitting on a porch to watch the stars enumerate themselves and struggling to find the words to catch it all, then finding them.
There's something about coming here to the Berry's place that reminds us what life is really all about. I need to move in. Wendell, Tanya, can I just move in? Well, this is a very special place, and this event is always a very special event. I'm going to read a little bit from Pray Song for the Kitchen Ghost. I guess all I'll say is that this was a book that I wrote intentionally to be able to go from the nightstand to the kitchen. So there are family recipes, there are archival photographs from my family in here, and 14 essays. And so I'm going to read like the opening of one of the essays. It's the second essay in the book, and it's called How I Learned to Cook. And one thing about this book, even though I've written about my family a lot, sort of cloaked in fiction and sort of hidden under and with poems, and you wouldn't believe a book about cooking could make someone cry so much, but every time I even look at the book or open it or see one of the pictures of my family, I start bawling, so bear with me. I got a couple of months to get it together before I go on the road. How I Learned to Cook. 2 years before I was born, while sitting at the kitchen table with my grandmother and aunt, my mother announced that the tines on her fork had spread wide as a grown man's hand, and that the fork no longer fit inside her mouth. My grandmother and my aunt held up the fork to the light so that Mama could see that it was just an ordinary fork. In fact, the very one she had just eaten supper with. But Mama refused to believe it, her schizophrenia having more power than anything her family said. I imagine this moment often, the women who would shape the woman I'd become, sitting at the very table in my grandmother's kitchen where I would receive all my lessons, their heads bowed, their eyes wide in wonder, trying to rid Mama of the notion of the magical fork. As black women, as good country women, I'm sure they were already trying to find ways to tell each other hush now, already trying to bury the story in the bottom of a well of grief, for my mother would never again be the woman they remembered. I conjure her that evening as a sultry 20-year-old with her long sable legs crossed, her eyes black and shimmering, Granny's and Auntie's lips pursed with worry, all three women already pregnant with all those secrets. All of this, I'm sure they kept from my grandfather, who was somewhere readying the animals for the night. I'm sure there were still remnants of supper on the table, melting ice in the glasses, pots of food on the stove while they sat in great communion. Out of desperation, my grandparents sent my mother away to Ohio to live with her oldest sister, Mary Elizabeth, to see if a change of place would soothe her mind. Mama found work cleaning for white women and met and fell in love with my father, but her mind never eased. 2 years into her stay with Aunt Mary, Mama became pregnant with me, and shortly after I was born, she suffered another mental break. My mother and I went home to live with my grandparents on Indian Creek, leaving my father behind. My mother would never see my father again. I wouldn't even meet him until I was 14 years old. Eventually, as her condition deteriorated, Mama was institutionalized and never lived on Indian Creek again. Once my mother left the hospital, she moved to Lexington to become a beautician and then a housekeeper in a hotel and finally a dishwasher in the back of a white man's restaurant. At 4 years old, I see my mother often, but she has become more like a sister. I am my grandmother's shadow, always clinging to her skirt tail. I am climbing into the kitchen chairs to stretch my neck and stand on tiptoe to see what she is cooking. I sometimes sit on the same table where Mama's magical fork appeared and watch my grandmother cook. I watch her stir and pour and flip and taste. I take note of how she twists her mouth when the steam hits her face, signaling the potatoes are ready for mashing. I know the ease in her shoulder when the fried chicken has reached its crispy, golden perfection. I was a quiet, shy observer who wondered where her mother had gone, but we never talked about my mother. Our focus was on keeping the house, keeping the family fed. We are a silent people. There was never much instruction. Granny is thankful every day that she sees few signs of Mama in me, but there was no doubt that I was Dorsey Jean's child. Even with her mental illness, or despite it, my mother was pensive, too, a talented visual artist who played piano by ear. I became a writer. I learned how to cook by sight. My grandmother, like many women from Appalachia, called the meal in the middle of the day dinner. I remember chicken and dumplings, pot roast, or peas and pork chops. Sometimes there were brown beans, vegetable soup, or chili, fried corn fresh from the garden. Sometimes she placed the salad in the middle of the table in a brown wooden bowl. There was always cornbread and rolls. There was always pie. Granny always set the table. My grandfather always led us in prayer. My grandmother fetched water from the well. She slopped the hogs, canned vegetables, and stored them in the cellar, fed chickens, milked cows, shucked corn, but there were always 3 meals on the table, precise, orderly, delicious. Supper in my childhood was on the table by 6 in the evening. Lamb fries, frog legs, fried whiting or catfish, neck bones, fried chicken livers. Have y'all ate yet? Or gizzards, corn pudding, tall glasses of water pulled from the well or sweet iced tea, biscuits topped with rhubarb, butter, and sugar. After supper, we'd watch TV. Sometimes I ventured out to catch June bugs or lightning bugs in a mason jar. My grandfather nodded in the reclining chair. My grandmother quilted, sewed clothes for herself and me, but always had her eye on something in the oven. Bread, a pie for our preacher, or someone whose loved one had done crossed over. I read books. I learned, waited. There was always something dead in the kitchen. On occasion, a squirrel or a rabbit shot and skinned, a bucket of recently caught fish, a chicken with feathers who I had given the name. I remember an entire hog's head in a galvanized tub, its tongue sticking out. My grandparents hoisted the tub with the hog's head up on the stove. It covered all 4 burners. After it simmered nearly all day, my grandmother made souse. She let the meat cool, called my grandfather in to pour the broth into a clean container, then dug in with both her hands, separating the meat from the bone, removing bits of hard gristle until she had a large tub of torn bits of meat. She added black pepper, salt, and sage, called my grandfather back into the kitchen to taste until they both deemed the rich concoction perfect. My grandmother's sauce was never spicy with red pepper or sour with vinegar like modern hoghead cheese I've tasted. I remember making a meal of it while it was warm. My grandmother placed the meat in loaf pans and then poured cups of the collagen-rich broth back over the meat and allowed it to chill overnight. The next morning, she battered and fried a few slices for breakfast, or we'd eat it as lunch meat with bread or crackers. Modern palates might call sauce a form of aspic or pâté. They'd be wrong, but perhaps close. My grandmother used a hand-cranked meat grinder to make relish from cucumbers, onions, green peppers, and spices. By nightfall, the hills, the knobs, the fields belonged to nature, but inside we were safe and warm and fed. I don't remember exactly when I started cooking, but there is a photograph of me as a girl standing at the stove with a splotch of grease on the front of my dress, holding a spatula, my hip cocked, a grown-up look on my face. I've always felt a power larger than myself while cooking. I learned how to cook by saying nothing, watching how each ingredient was managed, but so much of the art of cooking lies in the body. I gained knowledge about the spirit of the cooks who came before me, the rhythm in the way they sloshed the greens in the sink, removed a pot seconds before it burned, drew a knife close enough to the finger to hold the vegetable taut but never cut themselves. A kind of electric excitement passed through me when I watched Granny cook. Even now I don't know what to call it, but there was a grace and poise in her kitchen dance. I remember how my heart raced the first time I peeled potatoes with Granny's favorite paring knife without wasting the flesh. I peeled potatoes with Granny's favorite paring knife without wasting the flesh. There was no instructions, but she warned me often of the dangers of waste. She'd tell me that I'd left enough food behind to feed another mouth. She never wasted anything. I watched her scrape a bowl of cake batter so clean that it looked as if she'd already doused it in the dishpan. She often told me that she came through the Great Depression. Something like that'll change a body, she said. Even with generations between us, I learned to mimic my grandmother's movements so well that I imagined that I had actually become her. I, too, even being of the generation of plenty, was aware of both the perils of waste and the dread of never having enough. Thank you.
I need to begin by thanking everybody. Some people dear to me worked hard to make this possible and were anxious, but it would have amounted to nothing if the writers wouldn't come and if the audience didn't come. So this is a communal effort, and I'm deeply grateful. I'm trying to write short stories, really short. This is a story called Mr. Lowstutter. My cousin and I were talking at the post office and got pretty soon in the course of nature onto the subject of forgetfulness, a subject that seems to me not to have been so prominent back in the old days, but I may have forgot. We exchanged some examples, and I said, "This reminds me of Granddaddy's story about Mr. Lowstutter." Mr. Lowstutter was the owner of a racetrack down at Hargrave. One time he made a trip down the river to Louisville. His business down there was to participate in the delights of the big city to the limit of his capacity. He was on the steamboat coming back upriver to Hargrave, standing out on the deck, holding tight to the railing, when another gentleman, a stranger, came up and stood beside him. They fell into conversation, which lasted a pleasant while. The time came for introductions. The stranger made his manners to Mr. Lowstutter and stuck out his hand. Mr. Lowstutter started to reciprocate, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came out, for he could not remember the words by which he normally identified himself. He said, "Sir, do you know by any chance the name of the old fella who owns the racetrack at Hargrave?" "Why, yes, sir, I believe that would be a Mr. Lowstutter." "Yes," Mr. Lowstutter said, "that's right. That's me. I'm glad to meet you, too." That's the real way to tell a story. It's short. I know a lot of stories like that, and they always, when they come to me, they offer an invitation to elaborate, and I haven't often enough been able to resist. This is a story called Let's Go. While Elton Penn was still farming the Jack Beecham place as a tenant, he bought the old Woodward Hayes place. It was a hill farm, its heights overlooking the river valley, with some good ridges arable with care, some steep slopes long in woods, and some gentler slopes usable with care as pasture, but long neglected. The buildings on it, nearly all of them, were still upstanding and in good condition. The house, painted white, stood on its highest point. It was a landmark, visible for miles from other heights of the ground. Elton by then had a reputation at the Independent Farmers Bank for hard work, thrift, and honesty. The farm was small, less than 100 acres, and too rough and run down to be attractive to much of anybody, except Elton, who saw it as a step upward. Or it would be, as soon as he repaid the loan at the bank, which he fairly promptly did. Living at the house at the time of the sale were Billy and Myrtle Treadwell. Billy, having farmed the place in the previous few years as a tenant, growing the tobacco crop on the shares and milking half a dozen cows on his own behalf. Elton asked him to stay on for the present year, keeping the old arrangement and working by the day for wages as needed. Billy was a small man, wedded to a somewhat strapping woman with ample physical assets, a subject of merriment in the neighborhood. But never mind, Billy was a good enough hand, and when he and Elton worked together, they got along. At the time I'm remembering, Elton was ready to mow for hay, a stand of oats interseeded with bluegrass and red clover in the biggest field. The oats were at exactly the right stage for cutting, and Elton was exactly ready to get them cut. As they had planned and prepared, Billy would mow with his small tractor and Elton with his large one, and they would get over the whole field by dinner time. The hay then could begin drying in the heat of that afternoon. The weather was promising, but with that kind of hay, you don't have a minute to waste, or so you feel. Elton had driven into the barn lot and was making a final adjustment on his mowing machine when Billy came out of the house with a great worry on his face. He said, "I got to go to the dentist this morning, Elton. I got a tooth. Been aching me all night long. I got to get it pulled." As it happened, Elton was holding in his hand a smallish pair of channel lock pliers, the kind with the overleaning jaws. He said, "Let me see it." Billy opened his mouth and Elton looked in. "Which one is it?" Billy stuck his finger in his mouth and pointed. "It's a right ear." Elton had fallen suddenly into one of his moods when he observed himself with curiosity, and who knows what powers governed him at such times. "Let me have another look at that tooth. Open wide now, let some daylight in." He spoke with much sympathy, undoubtedly sincere, half for Billy, half for himself and his still standing hay. Billy obliged by opening his mouth as wide as he could, the effort requiring him to squeeze his eyes shut. Elton didn't yet quite believe he was going to do what in another moment he had done. "Hold right still." He clamped the pliers onto the tooth, gave it what he meant to be an experimental little twist, and out it came. "Ow!" Billy said. Elton was holding the tooth in the air, about as surprised, he later reported, as Billy looked. "You didn't know I got my start as a dentist?" Billy looked at him with his eyes as wide as possible, and then he leaned over and spat blood. It looked pure, Elton thought, purely red. He thought then about the tooth that he still held in the jaws of his pliers. The feeling came over him strongly that he did not want to be the one to throw it away. He said, "Here," and held the tooth out to Billy. Billy held out his hand. Elton opened the pliers and dropped in the tooth. Billy threw it away farther than necessary. He spat some more blood. He said, "One eye," with his tongue in the hole where the tooth had been. "Does it still ache?" "No." "Well, we got the right one." What do you reckon you owe me? I've saved you 2 tooths worth of gas and half a day's pay. It came to Elton then that his enjoyment of the occasion was running somewhat ahead of Billy's. He decided to keep quiet for a while. For a while then, they stood looking at each other as if mutually in hard thought, Billy interrupting only to lean to the side and spit. And then it appeared to Elton that the blood was getting pinker and the morning was getting away. Billy, are you all right? Yeah, I'm all right. Well, let's go.